Hello, my name is Kathy Saunders. I am a program development and training consultant for ServeRI, our state's service commission supported by the Rhode Island Department of Education. I am also a former ServeRI subgrantee and have many years of experience writing and managing AmeriCorps grants. I am the presenter for this webinar on logic models. This webinar is being recorded in one run, so please excuse any technical difficulties or stumbles along the way. By the end of the video, grant applicants will, at a high level, understand the purpose of a logic model for programming and planning and grant development, how the logic model connects to your grant application, how to approach drafting a logic model for your application, and how to connect this video with AmeriCorps resources available to you. The logic model is a required component of your AmeriCorps grant application. It's a very specific item of your application, and there is a template that needs to be followed, and you will use it to draft your performance measures as well. Sometimes people are intimidated by the logic model, and so we'd like to begin by stepping back to understand the purpose of a logic model and how it might be helpful to you before we dive into the details of your application's logic model. A logic model is sometimes called a roadmap. It's a vision for the end point and a plan for how you want to get there. For example, if I want to go to San Francisco, then I need to plan my route. If I plan to fly, my route and resources invested will be very different than if I drive. So that plan, roadmap, or logic model can be helpful. And as the slide says, the logic model can be helpful in a variety of settings, not just your grant application. So a logic model is a depiction of a program showing what the program will do and what the program intends to accomplish. It's a series of if-then relationships that, if implemented as intended, lead to desired outcomes. And it is the core of program planning and evaluation, so it has usefulness beyond just completing your application. The NOFO states that the logic model is a visual representation of the applicant's theory of change. So let's go over what the theory of change is. This is a theory of how you believe your intervention can address or solve an identified problem or need. And underlying the theory is a set of assumptions supported by evidence about why your specific intervention is likely to lead to the desired outcomes. There are three main components as illustrated in this diagram. There's the community problem you are trying to solve, the intervention you propose, and the intended outcome of that intervention. Well, what can that theory of change look like in practice? Let's go over an example. On this slide, we present an example of a theory of change for a nutrition assistance program. For this hypothetical program's theory of change, the problem or need that has been identified is that too many low-income families in the community are not aware of up-to-date nutrition information and nutrition resources that are available to them, and therefore they suffer poor health consequences. To address this problem, a research-based nutrition assistance program was developed that consists of a combination of nutrition education and referrals to community services. The intended outcome or goal of this intervention specified in this theory of change is an improvement in families' overall health. Now, the logic model is a detailed visual representation of the program and its theory of change. It communicates how a program works by depicting the intended relationships among program components. It takes a high-level conceptual theory of change and creates a plan or a roadmap for how to implement it. This can generate a clear and shared understanding of how a program works, support program planning and program improvement, and serve as a foundation for evaluation. So let's go over the components here. On the left, there are the inputs invested in the program. There are the outputs, or what the program does and who participates, in the middle of the chart. And then on the right side, there are the outcomes, which are the results or the benefits of the program. Let's look at this simplified everyday example. The need or the problem that you are trying to solve is that you have a headache. The input or the thing you invest is some headache pills. The output or the activity that you do is to actually take those pills. Now, the outcome or the result is that you feel better. Here's a second example. The need or problem is that you are hungry. The input or the thing you invest is some food. Well, the activity, that output, is that you eat the food. And the outcome or the result is that you feel better. You read a logic model from left to right. There are two sides to a logic model. The process side is the inputs, activities, and outputs, and the outcome side is the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. Note, long-term outcomes will not be realized in the time period of your grant. Your grant is going to be focused on the short and maybe medium-term outcomes. There are two main approaches used to create logic, to create a logic model. There's the forward logic, which moves from left to right and uses if-then statements. And then there's reverse logic, which moves right to left and asks but how questions. This diagram illustrates the forward logic method. It uses if-then statements. You read it from left to right. If we put in these resources and activities, they will result in specific outcomes, outputs, and outcomes. Now, I'm not going to read through this chart in detail, but I recommend that you refer back to it. The other method is using reverse logic, which asks how. You are basically reading your logic model from right to left. You start with your desired outcome and then work backwards to ask, how did we get there? Again, I'm not going to read this through here. I recommend you refer back to it. Now, the reality is that you will likely use a little bit of both models to create yours. You probably have a vision of your long-term outcome, and you know the basics of what your inputs are. So you can use if-then statements and the question how to fill in the gaps in between to create a logic model. Once you have a draft of your logic model, you need to verify that it is, well, logical. Does it have enough detail to be useful and understandable for the program design? Is it plausible? Is it logical? This is where running an if-then test can be very helpful. Is it realistic? Is this likely to be achieved? And finally, do you have consensus and buy-in from the needed people? The forward and reverse logic model charts can be very helpful, not only in creating your logic model, but also in reviewing it. I'll give an example. I was once on a team where we wrote a logic model for an application. When we finally ran the if-then test on it, we realized that those inputs would not logically result in the outcomes that we were proposing. So we had to make some adjustments, and I'm really glad we caught it before we submitted our application. Now I'm going to shift focus to speak specifically about the requirements for your application's logic model. The logic model that you submit with your grant application needs to be narrowly focused and align with your performance measures. It's very specific, and you need to adequately address all the items on the worksheet. And you will need to enter lines of text into the application system. And your final must be 3 pages when printed from eGrants, the application system. So you be sure to familiarize yourself with the technology before you finalize your logic model. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over specific components of the logic model so that you can be prepared to address those items in the worksheet. The key components of the AmeriCorps logic model are inputs or resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes, short, medium, and long term. On the far left are inputs or resources, which include the human, financial, organizational, and community resources available for carrying out a program's activities. You must include the sites or locations where members will be providing services and the number of AmeriCorps members who will deliver the intervention. Other things you can include are program staff involved, volunteers, funding partners, curriculum, or other key resources you will use in your implementation. The activities are what you do, the processes, tools, events, and actions that are used to bring about a program's intended changes or results. Some examples are workshops on healthy food options, food preparation counseling, referrals to food programs and resources, after-school math programs, literacy tutoring. For your grant, these activities are the core activities that define the intervention or program model that members will implement or deliver. You must include the duration of the intervention. For example, the total number of weeks, sessions, or months of the intervention, the dosage of the intervention. For example, the number of hours per session or sessions per week, and the target population for the intervention. For example, disconnected youth, third graders at a certain reading proficiency level. It's very important that you include duration, dosage, and target population in your logic model, so be sure not to overlook this part. Output measures the amount of service provided. What exactly that means depends on your program design. For many subgrantees, the outputs are likely to be the number of people served by the program. However, for some programs, it could be other types of counts, such as the number of acres of land treated by AmeriCorps members or the number of organizations served. If applicable, identify which performance measures will be used as output indicators. Outputs have measurable targets, and these targets should be achievable or realistic. Outcomes are the benefits resulting from the inputs, activities, and outputs. These are the expected changes in skills, knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition that occur as a result of the intervention. Outcomes should be logically connected to your program services or activities, and they also should be aligned with your outputs. So if your output counts the number of people served by the program, the outcome should reflect a change in those same people's knowledge, attitudes, behavior, or condition in life. Remember, outputs, what we showed on the previous slides, are what you do and who you reach, but outcomes are whether it made a difference or a positive impact. And as indicated on this slide, outcomes fall on a continuum ranging from short to long-term results. Short-term outcomes are changes in knowledge, skills, and/or attitudes. For example, the increase in knowledge of healthy choices. Medium-term outcomes are the changes in behavior or action. So that might be the adoption of that new knowledge of healthy food practices. And long-term outcomes are changes in condition or status in life that ultimately they gain food security. Now, long-term outcomes will not happen in the year-long period of the grant. These are aspirational. If applicable, identify which national performance measures will be used as output and outcome indicators. Targets for short and medium long-term outcomes should be achievable in the year of your grant. Many people get tripped up about what is an output and what is an outcome. It can be helpful to remember that an outcome is knowledge about, is really about the benefits. It quantifies changes in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition. For example, someone attended a workshop, that's an output. Someone benefited from the workshop, that's an outcome. Now here we have an example for an after-school program. It's theory of change. They've identified the problem or need. They've described what the intervention is, and they have the intended outcome and all those components. So then, because we know that the logic model is that visual representation of that theory of change, they've now moved that into this chart. And you'll see on the first part here, the inputs, activities, and outputs, that they've had placeholders here for number of full-time AmeriCorps members, number of minimum times, so specifying that number of members, and they're specifying the number of sites. That's required. These other things are applicable to their program, so they've added those. Then when you get to the activities, you can see that they've added the dosage, that how many weeks, how many frequent is it? So you have that duration and dosage in there as well. And then here you can see on the outputs that they've indicated that it connects with a national performance measure. And as well on this chart, you can see that they've identified the target population here. Then as we continue across the chart, we come to the outcomes. And you can see again, they've identified national performance measures where applicable. They've put measurable targets, and they are measuring the outcomes connected on the same population that the outputs are related to. And you can also see that they move across that continuum, that we have an increased knowledge as short term, then we have increase in intended or in disciplinary incidents, so that's behavior, and then the long term is about well beyond the life cycle of the grant. The logic model is not an afterthought in your application. It is the link between your theory of change and your performance measures. The NOFO states logic model is a visual representation of the applicant's theory of change. Programs should include short, medium, or long-term outcomes in the logic model. The applicant's performance measures should be consistent with the program's theory of change and should represent significant program activities. Now, whether you are using a national performance measure or an applicant-determined measure, you will need to flesh out the activities, indicators, outputs, and outcomes specific to your program for that measure. The logic model can help you identify those components for that measure. So we are coming to the end. I'm going to share some resources on these next pages. First are general resources about logic models that are very good and relevant. These next resources are specifically provided from AmeriCorps and will give you guidance specific to the requirements in your application. And finally, Adam Donaldson at ServeRI is your point person for all questions about your AmeriCorps application. Good luck. AmeriCorps programs are great additions to our community, and we're excited that you are working on an application.